When I told my parents about the fertility diagnosis, I expected shock, maybe some sadness, and hopefully some comfort for their daughter who was dealing with devastating medical news. Instead, my mother literally stood up from the kitchen table and walked out of the room without saying a word. My father just sat there staring at me like I had personally ruined his retirement plans, which apparently I had since those plans involved spoiling grandchildren that were never going to exist. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours before my father finally spoke, and his first words weren't asking if I was okay or offering support, but wondering out loud if the doctors were absolutely certain about the diagnosis. My mother came back after a few minutes looking like someone had died, which I guess in her mind someone had since her imaginary grandchildren had just been officially declared non-existent. She started asking questions about second opinions and experimental treatments like she was planning a military campaign to overcome my defective reproductive system. She wanted to know if we had considered adoption, surrogacy, or basically any option that would still result in her getting the grandchildren she had been promised. The idea that we might need time to process this life-changing diagnosis before jumping into solution mode apparently never occurred to her. Scott tried to explain that we were still learning about treatment options and would need to make decisions together about how to proceed, but my parents were having none of it. They acted like my fertility issues were a problem that existed specifically to inconvenience them, rather than a medical condition that was affecting my life and marriage. My father started talking about the money they had already mentally spent on baby gifts and college funds, like my ovaries had committed some kind of financial fraud against their future plans. The conversation got increasingly surreal as they began treating my diagnosis like a personal betrayal instead of a medical reality that none of us could control. My mother mentioned how embarrassing it would be to tell their friends that there wouldn't be any grandchildren after all the bragging they had done about our wedding and future family plans. My father wondered aloud if we had done something wrong to cause this problem, like my fertility issues were the result of poor life choices rather than random biological circumstances. Within a week of that initial conversation, their behavior toward me completely changed back to the cold indifference I had grown up with. Except now it was worse because I knew exactly why they were disappointed. They stopped calling to check on how I was handling the diagnosis or ask about our next steps with fertility treatments. They canceled plans we had made for upcoming family dinners and suddenly became too busy to spend time with us when we needed support the most. My mother started making passive-aggressive comments about other families who had been blessed with grandchildren, sighing dramatically whenever she saw babies in public, and generally acting like my medical condition was something I had chosen to inflict on her personally. She would mention friends whose daughters had successful pregnancies after fertility treatments, but always with this tone that suggested I wasn't trying hard enough or caring enough about giving her what she wanted. My father became distant and uncomfortable whenever fertility topics came up, like he couldn't stand to be reminded that his investment in our relationship hadn't paid off the way he expected. He stopped asking Scott about work or sports, apparently losing interest in bonding with a son-in-law who wasn't going to produce the grandchildren he had been promised. The worst part was how they made it clear that they blamed me specifically for this disappointment, even though fertility issues can affect either partner and weren't anyone's fault. They never suggested that Scott might have contributed to our conception difficulties or that this was just an unfortunate medical situation we were dealing with together. In their minds, I was the broken one who had failed to fulfill my primary purpose as their daughter. The breaking point came during a family dinner about 6 weeks after the diagnosis, when my mother made a comment about how some people just aren't meant to be parents and maybe we should accept that reality instead of fighting it. I had been holding back my frustration for weeks, trying to be understanding about their disappointment while dealing with my own grief about fertility challenges. But that comment pushed me over the edge. I told them exactly what I thought about parents who abandoned their daughter during a medical crisis because she couldn't produce the grandchildren they felt entitled to having. I explained how their conditional love had damaged me my entire life and how their reaction to my fertility issues proved they had never actually cared about me as a person, only as a means to an end they wanted to achieve. The phone call I made to them the next day was even more satisfying because I had spent the night planning exactly what I wanted to say about their pathetic excuse for parenting. I told them they were selfish, shallow people who had failed at the most basic requirement of being parents, which was loving their child unconditionally. I explained that they were losing their only daughter because they couldn't handle losing imaginary grandchildren, Their response was exactly as terrible as I expected, with my mother crying about how ungrateful I was and my father accusing me of being dramatic and oversensitive. They acted like I was overreacting to their completely reasonable disappointment, rather than calling them out for abandoning me during the worst period of my life. That phone call was the last time I spoke to either of them for 3 years, and it was the best decision I made during that entire horrible period.